Let's turn to Hurricane Laura now. Well, early this morning, it made landfall on the Louisiana and Texas coasts as one of the most powerful storms to ever hit the United States. 150-mile-an-hour winds at that time, a huge storm surge. Just in from Reuters now that it has weakened into a Category 1. However, still producing damaging winds and flooding rainfall spreading inland over parts of Louisiana. But let's talk more about the implications of Laura with Steve Bowen. He's a meteorologist, Aon chief meteorologist, and he's joining us from Chicago, Illinois. Steve, thank you for joining us. So as we look at this storm relative to storms that we've seen in the past, as I mentioned, this is one of the strongest we've seen. What are sort of the damage estimates looking like at this point?
Well, it's still a bit too early to have a good idea as to what the losses may be, mostly because the storm is still ongoing. It's still causing damage as it makes its way a bit north through Louisiana into parts of Arkansas, and eventually is going to basically take a hard right across the mid-Atlantic. So, but we do know that there has been catastrophic damage across parts of Lake Charles. There's some reports of damage across extreme southeast Texas. I think we're going to be talking about losses here well into the billions of dollars. Whether this ends up being one of the most expensive hurricanes we've had on record, that remains to be seen. I'd be surprised if we get that high, but we are definitely going to be talking about economic costs in the billions of dollars. And then from the insurance industry perspective as well, there is going to be very likely a multi-billion-dollar payout from this. But with these larger scale events, it does take quite a bit of time to do full assessments and really get the claims assessors on the ground and get a good idea as what the scope of the event is. Just for instance, we're still coming up with final numbers for Hurricane Irma in 2017, believe it or not. So these large scale disasters just do take quite a bit of time to finally get a full view of what the final cost is going to be.
Steve, why did this fall apart so quickly? I mean, obviously it's a great relief for so many people, but when we were originally talking about this storm, it was billed as the second Katrina potentially. We were talking about 20-foot storm surge, and obviously we did see widespread damage, but nothing near what we had seen with Katrina. And obviously the path was different, but why did it go from this Category 4 monster to this Category 1 so quickly?
Well, in terms of degradation over land, that's pretty standard. When you have a storm that loses that really warm fuel, essentially, of the ocean, it starts to travel over land. The frictional effects do lead to pretty quick weakening. But in terms of the coastal impacts from a surge standpoint, there has been some pretty substantial coastal damage from surge. Now, the challenging component of all this is that we don't have too many official gauges where the landfall point occurred. So, and the fact that it is so flat and there's so much marsh and not much elevation, it's going to be tough to find those watermarks. But preliminarily, we're seeing storm surge heights roughly 9 to 10 feet. I would not be surprised areas that were closest to the landfall point where it was even higher than that. The big difference from Katrina is the fact that with Katrina, you had the massive surge that affected a highly populated area, and then you had the levee failure on top of everything else. And that essentially opened the floodgates of inundation across a massive area, a major metropolitan area. So we haven't necessarily seen that. But in terms of the actual wind speed, this was a much stronger storm in terms of wind speed than Katrina was landfall. And you're actually starting to see some of those pictures emerge out of Lake Charles with substantial damage to windows and some of the mid and high-rise buildings there. So this is a storm that I would almost guarantee they're going to retire the name by the end of the season, just given the broad impact. But every storm is different. There's no consistency between a Katrina and a Harvey and any other storm we have. Just the size, structure, and just the overall physical impacts all make these storms very unique to their own.
And Steve, it's Julia LaRoche. And of course, you just mentioned every storm is certainly different. And we also have COVID-19 pandemic as the backdrop here. Walk us through some of the implications that you're seeing as we go through this current crisis or set of crises, really.
Sure. I mean, the biggest concern, obviously, is the humanitarian impact. When you have all these folks that are being forced to evacuate in the COVID environment, you're trying to ensure that emergency managers are keeping folks separate away from each other to not spread. But in terms of the relief and recovery, that is also going to lead to some challenges. We've seen that this year already with other large-scale disasters across the United States, where it's just simply taking a longer time to actually get on the ground and do the assessments, just because different protocols are in place between different companies. There's been much more introduction of, say, drone technology to try to get a quick initial burst of a view of what's going on. So COVID is not going to really affect the financial costs, I would say, but much more on the humanitarian side, and trying to ensure that people can get on the ground and try to help people get back on their feet as quickly as they can. And given the COVID environment, that's going to slow things down, unfortunately.
And Steve, you have coronavirus, of course, in the background, and you also have, on a sort of larger, even longer term scale, climate change and the effect that that has had on the hurricane season. How has that led you, both as a meteorologist and someone who works at an insurance company, to change your models for the next several years? I mean, I know that things like offering hurricane insurance has become much, much more expensive as we've seen an increase in storms.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I've been with Aon for 13 years at this point, and there's been a definite sea change in terms of clients and folks from all different types of sectors and their interest around climate change. And we are starting to see some pretty, I would say, noticeable shifts in terms of how these cyclones are behaving. You know, Laura is just the latest example of these storms undergoing rapid intensification prior to actually coming ashore. And typically storms weaken when they get closer to shore because of the frictional effects of land that I mentioned before. But with climate change, these storms are just tapping into some really deep, very warm water, and that's allowing for these storms to become much bigger and much bigger, much more quickly. Now, from the insurance side, we're not just looking at the physical hazard itself, but we're also looking at the fact that human beings just simply love moving to the coastlines. And unfortunately, if you look at statistics over the last couple of decades, there's been a sea change in terms of the number of people that are moving to these highly vulnerable locations. So if you're combining the assumption of more intense storms in the future with more people in harm's way, that's really not a good combination when you're talking about the overall risk.
Yeah, definitely not. Steve Bowen, thank you so much. Really interesting stuff. And meteorologist and head of Catastrophe Insight. Appreciate it.